Hey everyone, it's Julie again, and it's time for our second video on Leviticus. I hope the first one helped you, and I really hope you took my advice, read through Leviticus, and found some really weird stuff happening in the book of Leviticus. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video, is just what's weird in Leviticus, because there's a lot of it, and usually that's what gets people stuck. And so oftentimes people will start a one-year Bible reading plan. They'll start in Genesis, they'll love it, they'll start in Exodus. It's great. Then the second half of Exodus happens and everyone's like, what's happening? And then you hit Leviticus and you usually just stall because it's all sacrifices and blood and guts, and you're like, what's happening? So hopefully I'll help you kind of get over some of those things in this video. And so when we think about Leviticus and we think about when it was written and who it was written to, we really need to understand their mindset and just things that would have been common for them, especially when it comes to worship or just a relationship with a God in general. Because Israel at this time in their history, they've just left Egypt. So they've just left slavery. And so they are used to an Egyptian worldview. And they are in the middle of a journey to go to where God is going to have them live, which is the Promised Land, where the Canaanites are. And so what you're going to see in Leviticus is God is going to try to get them to unlearn what they learned in Egypt, and he's going to get them to prevent learning kind of what's happening in Canaan and what's going on with the religions there. And so God is forming Israel as a nation, and he's showing them how to interact with him for who he is, not who people say that he is. And so they're on their way from Egypt to Canaan, and God is going to be steering them exactly where he wants them to go. And Leviticus, like I mentioned, it's going to help them unlearn what was happening in Egypt and prevent what's going on in Canaan, prevent them from becoming like that culture. And so we need to understand, what are some things that Egyptian culture and Canaanite culture have in common? And it's this view of multiple gods and how you would relate to a god at that time. And so 3 of the common things that would be happening in both kind of societies would be these 3 common thoughts. So their view would be that they can manipulate a god. So a god just does what you want. As long as you do the right thing, you can manipulate him. The second thing is that a god won't do anything good unless I do something. So unless I convince him to do that in some weird ritual or some way of manipulating him. And then the third is that a god is always unhappy. And so these are things that we really need to understand, because we know today that that is not who God is. But how is Israel supposed to learn who God is unless this kind of threefold idea about a god is kind of taken out of their minds? And so the way that they would worship in those societies is that they'd always worship to get something that they needed. So it was always, if I do this for a god, he's going to give me that, which is not at all how our relationship with God works today. And one thing that's going to become really prevalent as you read through Leviticus is you're going to see how specific God is. God is very specific in how you can worship him, where you can worship him, and when you can worship him. And why? Well, that's because in Egypt and in Canaan, the way that they worship God is kind of any way that they please. And so when humans decide how to worship God, it usually involves something that's going to seek our own selfish desires and fulfill that need. And so that's why we have a lot of weird stuff in Leviticus. One of those things is there's a specific law that you cannot boil a goat in its mother's milk. Okay, so you can't kill a young goat, fill up a pot with its mom's milk and then cook it that way. You're not allowed to do that. And why is that? Well, a lot of worship in Canaan was based on fertility. And so they would do certain things in order to have more children, more livestock, better crops. And so it usually involved some kind of weird something. And the whole goat in the mother's milk is one of those specific things that they would do in the land of Canaan to worship one of their gods, so that they'd have a lot more goats, basically. So that's why they can't do that. There's a lot about sex in Leviticus. Why is there a lot about sex in Leviticus? Well, whenever humans decide how to worship, usually it's something that suits our own pleasures and our own desires. And so in the environment of Canaan, a lot of the worship has to do with sexual rituals and just a lot of weird stuff. I would go into it, but I really don't want to. And so that's why there's a lot of explanation about that and, who you can have sex with, why you can't go to the tabernacle after, you need to have a bath, all that stuff. There's a reason for all of it. And again, it's separating out who God is based on how the Canaanites worship. So if Israel's going to go into the land of Canaan, God doesn't want them or any of their worship of him to look similar to any of the worship that's happening in the land of Canaan. So that's why God is specific on these things. And there's a lot of blood. Okay, there's a lot of blood talked about in Leviticus. Why? We don't talk about blood much today unless you're giving blood or having it taken for a test or something. But since the Canaanites and the Egyptians, they're obsessed with fertility, they're obsessed with life and all of this different kind of thing. And so a lot of their worship involved blood as well. However, God says some really important things about blood in Leviticus that is going to be really significant for us in Hebrews as well. And so Leviticus teaches that the life is in the blood. And so, first of all, knowing the 10 Commandments, blood, life, God is in control of that. We're not. And so he's the one that says when you can take a life and when you can't. And so it's so important when we talk about Leviticus to kind of address why blood is important in this book as well. And I'll unpack that more as we go. Rashes. Okay, there's a lot of leprosy. There's a whole bunch of chapters on leprosy. And you might think it's just one kind of leprosy, but there's actually multiple kinds of rashes happening in Leviticus, and they refer to it as leprosy. And why am I bringing this up? You might wonder, why are rashes important in the Bible? Well, it actually shows us something really important about God, because God is showing his people how to prevent disease. He's showing them how to wash themselves. He's showing them, how to deal with mold in your house. All of these things they wouldn't know how to do because they're coming out of slavery. And he knows the climate and the land that they're going into, and he's going to know what they're going to need to stay healthy and to stay whole. And so all the weird things that are in Leviticus, they actually show us so much about God. They show us that he's different, that he's set apart. He can't be worshipped like any other God because he is God. It shows that he's protective, and it shows that he's in control, and that he wants to be worshipped as well. And so God is the only God, and he's going to decide how he's going to be worshipped. And that's what a lot of Leviticus deals with. And there's no other God that tells how to worship, right? God is the only God, and he says, I'm God, and this is how you're going to worship me. So that's why Leviticus is really important for us as well. And so just a couple questions for you to end off, to end this off is, do you worship God to get stuff? And you might not think you do, but it's actually a really important question to think about is, are you going to church to get more time on Netflix because your parents want you to go? Or are you worshiping God because, you're scared of what'll happen if you don't? What are your motives in your relationship with God? And what shapes you? Okay, so the book of Leviticus is God wants to shape his people. He wants them to represent him and to look holy. And so what is shaping you? Is it your friends? Is it culture? Is it media? Or is it God's truth and what he's spoken into your life? And so I just want to leave you with those questions. Have a think about them. If you haven't read all of Leviticus yet, please keep going. It's really interesting. And that's it for this video. And in our next one, we'll get into more fun stuff. So thanks for listening.